America's sole federal supermax prison, which many also called America's toughest prison. This prison houses some of the world's most dangerous offenders, including El Chapo, Ted Kaczynski, and Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. And it's clear from these names that people don't end up at ADX by chance. So what's the big deal about this place? Watch the whole video to get a deeper perspective of this prison. Only 2 hours from Denver, on a 37-acre campus in Fremont County, is America's highest security federal prison, the U.S. Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, or ADX. The ADX in Florence, Colorado, is the only supermax federal prison. It is filled with the most dangerous and likely to escape federal prisoners. So let's get into detail about it. There are about 400 male inmates. There are about 400 male inmates at ADX, and some of them are well known. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, a well-known drug lord, was sent to ADX after he broke out of 2 Mexican prisons with the highest security twice. Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber, is in there. And so are Eric Rudolph, who bombed the Atlanta Olympics; Zacarias Moussaoui, who planned 9/11; Terry Nichols, who bombed Oklahoma City; Ramzi Youssef, who attacked the World Trade Center in 1993; and Michael Swango, a doctor who poisoned and killed up to 60 of his patients.
There are an estimated 80,000 people locked up in solitary confinement in America. You're about to meet a prison official who wants to experience it firsthand. He's embarking on a radical, risky experiment, entering level 6 solitary confinement himself.
Many of them have killed people, either on the outside or in other prisons. Some of them have even killed guards. Others are members of hardcore gangs who have ordered or done prison hits. One estimate says that as many as a third of the men who live at ADX have been diagnosed with a mental illness that makes them dangerous to themselves and others. Critics of the ADX and other supermax prisons, on the other hand, say that the conditions inside these hyper-secure facilities, where prisoners spend 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, are the definition of cruel and unusual punishment. No matter what these men did or how sick they were, the United Nations say that they even count as torture. So how's life inside ADX Florence? At other prisons, people who act violently or aggressively are put in solitary confinement for short periods of time. This type of punishment, solitary confinement, is called administrative segregation, but most people call it the hole. At ADX, which is also called the Alcatraz of the Rockies, the whole prison is the hole. The New York Times says ADX prisoners spend 23 hours a day in their 7x12 foot cells. They get all of their food through a hole in the cell door, and the only way they can see the outside world is through a small window that looks out at nothing. This keeps prisoners from learning how the prison is set up and where their cells are. ADX Florence has never let anyone out. Since ADX inmates cannot be trusted with anything that could be broken down and turned into a weapon, all the furniture in their cells is made of solid concrete and cannot be moved. There is a concrete writing desk, a concrete chair, and a concrete slab with a thin foam pad on top that serves as a bed. The bathroom is a toilet, sink, and shower all in one. The shower turns on by itself 3 times a week. If a prisoner is good, he or she can buy a small black and white TV with a radio built in and check out books and magazines from the prison library. Close family can only talk on the phone for 15 minutes a month. Each month, prisoners are allowed 5 visits, but only under strict rules. Inmates are only allowed out of their cells for an hour of exercise each day. Handcuffed and chained at their feet, prisoners are either led to an empty room with a single pull-up bar or taken outside to the yard and locked alone in a cage pen. Robert Hood, who used to be a warden at the ADX, told the New York Times that the ADX was a dangerous place, not made for people to live in. Let's be honest, when you spend 23 hours a day in a room with a tiny window through which you cannot even see the Rocky Mountains, you get bored. It's not made to help people get better. The story is over.
It is as stark can be. It was not designed with humanity in mind. To me, it's life after death.
But why? There are supermax prisons. At any given time, there are about 2 million people in prison or jail in the US. The US Bureau of Prisons says that a small part of this population gives wardens, guards, and other corrections workers a lot of trouble. People who were hard to control were called the most dangerous, recalcitrant, aggressive, and antagonistic inmates in a prison system. This made architects and builders build more secure facilities. In the 1980s, the first Supermax prisons were built. There are now more than 30 Supermax prisons in the US. ADX was built in 1994 and is the only federal Supermax prison. Karamet Ryder teaches criminology and law at the University of Irvine in California. He also wrote 23/7 Pelican Bay Prison and the Rise of Long-Term Solitary Confinement, which is about a Supermax prison in California. Ryder said that the main reason for Supermax prisons is that some people are so dangerous that they need to be kept away from the rest of the prison population. If they were taken away, everyone else would be better off. In theory, people would be less violent and less likely to join gangs if they were locked up in these harsh and limiting conditions. But Ryder says there is not a lot of evidence to support the idea that almost total isolation is a good way to stop violence in prison. On the other hand, there is more and more evidence that long-term solitary confinement is like psychological torture and makes people more likely to hurt themselves or kill themselves. If this is what happens in the prison, then what happens to your body and mind when you are locked up? Ryder says that doctors have known since the 1960s and 1970s that solitary confinement and sensory deprivation have immediate and long-lasting effects on the brains and bodies of prisoners, as shown by the experiences of American POWs in Vietnam. We know that putting someone in solitary confinement can cause all kinds of mental problems in a matter of days, if not hours. For the last 20 years, Supermax prisons have been used as a kind of mass experiment to see how long-term isolation affects people. ADX prisoners only see other people when guards bring them food and walk them to the yard. Amnesty International found in a report from 2014 that ADX prisoners often go days without hearing more than a few words. Long-term solitary confinement can cause a wide range of problems, from depression and anxiety to full-blown hallucinations and psychotic breaks. The New York Times tells the disturbing story of an ADX inmate named Jack Powers. He was jailed for robbery and sent to ADX after escaping from another prison. Powers went crazy because he was left alone for a long time. He cut off his earlobes, chewed through a finger, and cut his head open so that he could inject bacteria-filled fluid into his brain. ADX has 6 different levels of security, and inmates can move from housing that is strict to housing that is less strict, or even to another prison. But even after being taken out of isolation, the effects of being alone remain. In 1993, a doctor named Stuart Gratian wrote about a condition he called SHU syndrome. SHU stands for Security Housing Unit, which is another name for solitary confinement. People with SHU syndrome have paranoia, panic attacks, anger, and psychotic symptoms. But are Supermax prisons unconstitutional? The 8th Amendment of the Constitution forbids cruel and unusual punishment. Since we know how solitary confinement affects people's minds, shouldn't prisons like ADX also be illegal? Ryder says that the conditions inside Supermax prisons are legal. They have been challenged a lot, but no court has said that keeping someone in solitary confinement for a certain amount of time or to a certain degree of deprivation is against the Constitution. The international legal community, on the other hand, is putting more and more pressure on the US to stop long-term solitary confinement. The United Nations, for example, has set up the Mandela Rules for how prisoners should be treated. These rules say that prolonged solitary confinement, which means being locked up alone for 22 hours or more, is the same as torture. At ADX, prisoners' rights have won some small victories. In 2016, the Bureau of Prisons settled a class action lawsuit with 100 mentally ill ADX inmates who had been denied antipsychotic medications and left to suffer in terrible conditions. Some of the most troubled inmates were moved to federal facilities where they can get better mental health care because of the settlement. The rest of the ADX prisoners who were found to be mentally healthy are still in their cells, serving life sentences in almost total isolation. That brings us to the end of the video. Hope that you have enjoyed it. Subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and press the bell icons for more updates like this one.